Nothing feels more paralyzing than staring at your own thoughts and realizing they're not moving. You want to act, to think clearly, to make progress, but the mind resists. Ideas don't connect. Decisions feel heavy. Even simple tasks seem coated in friction. This isn't laziness. It isn't lack of intelligence. It's a mental lock, and if you don't understand how it forms, you'll keep blaming yourself for a problem that isn't about effort at all. When the mind locks, people try to force it open. They push harder, think longer, consume more information, wait for motivation to magically return, and the more they push, the more rigid everything becomes. The truth is uncomfortable. Mental flow does not respond to pressure. It responds to structure. A locked system doesn't need more energy. It needs the right key. The first thing you need to understand is why nothing flows in the first place. The mind freezes when it's asked to do incompatible things at the same time. Create and judge. Explore and decide. Imagine freely while demanding certainty. When these commands collide, the system stalls. What you experience as nothing works is actually your mind protecting itself from contradiction. The first technique to unlock the mind is to separate creation from evaluation with ruthless clarity. Most people sabotage themselves at the starting line by judging ideas before they exist. They ask, "Is this good?" before asking, "Why, what is this?" That single mistake collapses mental movement. Evaluation is a braking system. Creation is propulsion. Using both simultaneously is like pressing the gas and the brake together. To apply this technique, you deliberately create a mental space where nothing is allowed to be good or bad, only existent or non-existent. You write, think, speak, or imagine without permission from your internal critic. The rule is simple: no correction while generating. Correction is postponed, not eliminated. This isn't about lowering standards, it's about sequencing them correctly. When you do this, something subtle happens. The mind relaxes. It stops defending itself. Flow resumes not because ideas are brilliant, but because movement itself has been restored. And movement, once restored, tends to organize itself naturally. If this resonates, pause for a moment and reflect on how often you kill ideas mid-birth. That single habit explains years of stagnation for many people. You don't need to comment anything clever, just notice it honestly. Awareness alone begins to loosen the lock. The second technique addresses a deeper problem: mental overload disguised as emptiness. When nothing flows, people assume there's nothing inside. In reality, there's too much. Unfinished thoughts, unresolved decisions, background worries, vague obligations, all competing silently for processing power. The system isn't empty, it's saturated. A saturated system cannot flow, it must be cleared before it can move. The technique here is externalization. Anything that stays in the mind consumes energy. Anything placed outside the mind becomes manageable. This means writing things down, not to solve them, but to remove them from active memory. Tasks, worries, questions, ideas, even nonsense. The content doesn't matter. The act does. Your mind is not designed to be a storage unit. It's designed to process, not to hold. When you force it to hold everything, it slows down dramatically. Externalization frees bandwidth, and freed bandwidth feels like clarity. This is why people often say they feel better just writing things out, even without solutions. The relief comes from unloading, not resolving. Once unloaded, flow has space to reappear. Ask yourself this: how many open loops are you carrying right now that don't belong in your head? You don't need to answer out loud. Just recognize that mental flow requires room, and room must be created deliberately. The third technique confronts a mistake almost no one questions: trying to think at the wrong scale. When nothing flows, people often try to solve the entire problem at once. They aim for the perfect plan, the full answer, the complete vision. The mind responds by freezing, not because it's incapable, but because the target is too large. The solution is to shrink the question until movement becomes inevitable. Instead of asking, "What should I do with my life?" ask, "What is the next small step that reduces confusion?" Instead of, "How do I fix this project?" ask, "What's one sentence that clarifies what this project is about?" Flow begins at the smallest unit of progress, not the grand resolution. This technique works because the mind prefers solvable problems. Give it one, and it engages willingly. Solve it, and momentum appears. Momentum changes chemistry. Chemistry changes perception. Suddenly, what felt impossible starts to feel workable. Stuckness is often just a scale error. If you've ever noticed that progress returns the moment you lower the bar, this is why. You didn't become smarter. You became more precise. The fourth technique is the most counterintuitive and the most powerful. When nothing flows, the instinct is to wait, to pause life until clarity returns. But clarity is not a prerequisite for action. Action is a generator of clarity. The mind unlocks through motion, not contemplation alone. This doesn't mean reckless action. It means deliberate, low-risk movement, doing something physical, changing environment, speaking thoughts aloud, engaging the body to wake the system. The mind evolved in motion. When the body is static, thinking degrades. A short walk, a change of posture, a shift of context. These are not distractions. They are resets. They signal to the nervous system that conditions have changed, and with that signal, rigidity softens. Many breakthroughs happen while walking, showering, or doing something mundane, not because the mind stopped working, but because pressure was removed and motion restored. When you understand this, you stop waiting for flow and start creating the conditions for it. At this point, something important becomes clear. Mental blockage is not a flaw in you. It's feedback. It's a signal that the system is being misused. And once you know the signals, you can respond instead of panic. If this is helping you see your own patterns more clearly, take a moment to share what stood out to you. Not for approval, for integration. Putting insight into words locks it into memory. These techniques are not motivational tricks. They are mechanical adjustments. You apply them and flow returns. Not perfectly, not forever, but reliably enough to move again. And movement is everything. You don't need to wait for inspiration. You need to remove the conditions that block it. When you do, the mind does what it's always been capable of doing: connect, adapt, and move forward. And if you want to keep exploring how to work with your mind instead of against it, stay with this channel. The goal here isn't to think more. It's to think with precision, freedom, and momentum. There is a moment, often overlooked, where mental blockage stops being a temporary state and becomes an identity. People begin to say, "I'm just stuck," as if stagnation were a personality trait rather than a signal. This is dangerous, because once you believe the blockage is who you are, you stop looking for how it works. And anything you don't understand, you can't change. The mind does not freeze randomly. It freezes when its internal rules are violated repeatedly. One of the most common violations is forcing linear thinking on problems that are not linear. When nothing flows, many people respond by tightening control, rigid plans, strict schedules, aggressive goals. This works for execution, but it suffocates exploration. And without exploration, the mind has nowhere to move. The next adjustment is learning to switch modes deliberately. The mind has different gears. One is analytical and sequential, another is associative and non-linear. When you demand answers that require exploration while staying locked in analytical mode, the system stalls. It's like trying to navigate a forest using only a ruler. To unlock flow, you must give the mind permission to wander with boundaries. This means setting a container, not a destination. For a limited time, you explore connections without needing conclusions. You ask questions without forcing answers. You let patterns emerge instead of demanding results. This controlled looseness restores movement without chaos. You might notice resistance to this idea. Many people associate wandering with wasting time, but mental wandering with intention is not distraction, it's reconnaissance. It's how the mind maps unknown terrain. Without it, you keep walking in circles, mistaking repetition for progress. Pay attention to how often you rush yourself out of exploration because you feel guilty for not doing something useful. That guilt is one of the strongest enemies of flow. It collapses curiosity, and curiosity is the fuel of insight. Another source of blockage hides in plain sight: emotional contamination. Thoughts do not exist in isolation. They are influenced by emotional states. When emotions are suppressed or ignored, they leak into cognition as friction. The mind feels heavy not because it lacks ideas, but because it's carrying emotional weight it hasn't processed. This is why logic alone fails when nothing flows. You cannot think your way out of an emotional knot. You must first acknowledge it, not analyze it. Acknowledge it. Naming the emotion reduces its grip. It tells the nervous system that the signal has been received. When you skip this step, the mind remains in a subtle defensive posture. Defense consumes energy, and an energy-draining system cannot flow. Notice how often you label yourself as unmotivated, when the real state is frustration, disappointment, or fear. Motivation doesn't disappear without cause. It withdraws when the system senses risk. Restoring flow means restoring a sense of safety, not comfort but safety. There is also a timing error that keeps many people stuck. They try to solve problems at moments when their cognitive capacity is low, late at night, when hungry, when overstimulated, when exhausted. Then they conclude they are incapable. This is not self-awareness, it's misattribution. Mental flow depends on state. The same mind that feels blocked at 1 hour may feel fluid at another. The mistake is judging the system based on its worst conditions. Instead, you learn when your mind opens naturally and place demanding thinking there. This requires observation, not discipline. When do ideas come easily? When do connections appear without force? These patterns are not random, they are data. Ignoring them is like ignoring weather while planning a flight. Once you align tasks with states, resistance drops dramatically. What felt like a character flaw reveals itself as a scheduling problem. Another invisible blocker is the demand for internal coherence too early. People want their thoughts to make sense immediately. They fear contradiction, but contradiction is often a transitional state. The mind tests opposing ideas before integrating them. If you shut this process down, integration never occurs. Allowing temporary inconsistency is uncomfortable but necessary. Clarity is not the absence of confusion, it's the resolution of it. And resolution requires passing through it, not avoiding it. If you're noticing yourself here, don't rush past it. Let it land. You're not broken. You've been interrupting the very processes that generate flow. At this stage, a shift usually happens. You stop seeing mental blockage as an enemy and start seeing it as information. Information about scale, state, emotion, timing, or mode. Each blockage points to a mismatch, and mismatches can be corrected. Take a moment to reflect on which mismatch appears most often in your life. You don't need to explain it to anyone, but if putting it into words helps you see it clearly, share it. Articulation transforms vague tension into something workable. The mind is not meant to be forced open. It's meant to be aligned. When alignment returns, flow follows, not as a burst of inspiration, but as steady movement. What comes next is integration. These techniques are not separate tricks. They work together. Separating creation from evaluation creates safety. Externalizing thoughts creates space. Shrinking the scale creates momentum. Motion restores chemistry. Mode switching allows exploration. Emotional acknowledgement removes friction. Timing respects capacity. Tolerance for contradiction allows synthesis. This is not self-help, it's system maintenance. When you treat your mind like a system instead of a mystery, frustration loses its power. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What condition am I violating?" That question alone unlocks progress. If you stay with this perspective, you'll notice something unexpected. Even difficult problems feel lighter, not easier, but lighter. Because weight comes from resistance, not complexity. Flow is not a gift reserved for special moments. It's a state that emerges when conditions are right. Learn to build those conditions, and nothing flows will stop being a dead end and start being a diagnostic signal, one you know how to respond to. At some point, once movement has been restored, a new risk appears, one that quietly shuts the system down again if you're not careful. It's the urge to immediately optimize everything. People feel flow returning and rush to lock it in, formalize it, turn it into a rigid method. And without realizing it, they recreate the very conditions that cause the blockage. Mental flow is sensitive to over-control. When you try to dominate it, it withdraws. This happens because the mind does not operate best under constant self-surveillance. When every thought is monitored, measured, and evaluated in real time, spontaneity collapses. The system becomes cautious, and caution slows thinking dramatically. This is why people often feel most creative when they're not trying to be. One of the most underestimated techniques for maintaining flow is strategic permission to be inefficient. Not sloppy, inefficient. Allowing yourself to think in ways that don't immediately pay off, to explore dead ends, to pursue ideas that won't be used. This is not wasted effort, it's insulation against rigidity. Efficiency belongs in execution. Exploration requires slack. If you demand immediate usefulness from every thought, the mind learns to produce only what feels safe. Safe ideas are rarely original, and originality is what often breaks stagnation. Another subtle blocker emerges from identity attachment. Once you've struggled with being stuck, you may start defining yourself as someone who is finally becoming clear. That sounds positive, but it creates pressure. Pressure to stay clear, pressure not to regress, and pressure collapses flow. Flow thrives in environments where regression is allowed. When the mind senses that confusion is unacceptable, it hides it. Hidden confusion accumulates. Accumulated confusion becomes blockage. This is why progress isn't linear and why trying to make it so backfires. Instead of asking, "Am I still flowing?" a better question is, "Am I responding correctly when flow disappears?" Because it will disappear. Repeatedly. That's not failure. It's normal system behavior. Another factor that quietly kills momentum is information overconsumption. When nothing flows, people often consume more content hoping something will unlock them. But intake without output creates congestion. Insight needs movement to integrate. Without expression, ideas pile up and compress. Thinking improves when it exits the head. This doesn't require publishing or performing. It requires articulation, speaking, writing, sketching, explaining, even to no one. Expression organizes thought. Suppressed thought remains chaotic. If you've been stuck, ask yourself how long it's been since you expressed your thinking without polishing it. Raw expression is not low-quality thinking. It's pre-structured thinking. Without it, clarity never arrives. There's also a physical component that's often ignored. Cognitive rigidity mirrors physical rigidity. When the body stays tense for long periods, the nervous system reinforces narrow patterns. Loosening the body loosens cognition. This isn't metaphorical, it's physiological. Flow improves when the body feels safe enough to release tension. That's why posture, breathing, and movement matter more than people expect. You don't think your way into relaxation, you signal it through the body. And when the body receives that signal, cognitive flexibility increases. Another overlooked principle is delayed meaning-making. People want to know immediately what something means, but meaning emerges after patterns stabilize. If you force interpretation too early, you freeze the process. Let thoughts exist before you assign them purpose. This requires tolerance for ambiguity. Ambiguity feels uncomfortable, but it's the doorway to insight. The mind must hold uncertainty long enough for structure to emerge organically. If you rush that stage, you get shallow conclusions that don't unlock anything. When you allow ambiguity, something interesting happens. The mind starts making connections on its own, not because you commanded it to, but because it finally has room to breathe. At this stage, many people realize the real problem was never nothing flows. The problem was that they tried to control thinking the same way they control tasks. Thinking doesn't respond to force, it responds to conditions, and conditions are adjustable. If you've followed this far, you're probably recognizing patterns in your own behavior, moments when flow disappeared, habits that quietly shut it down. This awareness is not meant to shame you, it's meant to give you leverage. Take a moment to consider this. When your mind locks, what do you usually do first? Push harder, consume more, judge yourself, avoid the problem. That reflex is the true blocker, not the situation itself. If naming that reflex helps you see it clearly, share it. Turning automatic reactions into conscious choices is one of the fastest ways to restore mental movement. Flow is not something you summon. It's something you stop preventing. Once you stop interfering by overjudging, over-consuming, over-controlling, over-identifying, the system begins to regulate itself. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. What remains is trust. Not blind trust, but informed trust. Trust built from understanding how the system behaves under different conditions. When you have that, being stuck no longer feels like a crisis. It feels like a signal you know how to read. And when signals stop scaring you, movement becomes inevitable. At the deepest level, mental flow returns when you stop treating the mind as a machine that must perform on command and start treating it as a system that responds to conditions. Most people never make this shift. They keep demanding output without preparing the environment. And when nothing flows, they interpret silence as failure instead of feedback. What you've been experiencing as blockage is often the mind saying, "This way of operating no longer works." That message feels uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. But it also offers something more valuable, the chance to upgrade how you think, not just what you think. When nothing flows, the instinct is to search for intensity, stronger motivation, stronger discipline, stronger pressure. But intensity is not intelligence. Pressure might produce short bursts of action, but it degrades long-term clarity. Sustainable flow comes from alignment, not force. This is where all four techniques converge. Separating creation from evaluation protects movement. Externalizing thoughts creates space. Shrinking the scale restores momentum. Introducing motion reactivates cognition. Together, they don't just unlock the mind once, they teach it how to unlock itself again and again. And that's the real skill. Not staying in flow forever, but knowing how to return to it without panic. Most people suffer not because they get stuck, but because they interpret being stuck as something personal and permanent. Once you understand that stagnation is situational, its emotional charge disappears. You stop fighting yourself. And when the fight ends, energy returns. There is also a quiet relief that comes with this understanding. You realize you don't need to fix yourself. You need to stop misusing the system. That shift alone removes an enormous amount of mental weight. Over time, something changes in how you approach problems. You become less dramatic about confusion, less reactive to resistance, less attached to immediate clarity. You stop asking it, "Why isn't this working?" and start asking, "What condition is missing?" That question is powerful because it assumes progress is possible. It turns frustration into diagnosis, and diagnosis is actionable. You'll also notice that your confidence changes. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. Confidence that comes from knowing you can handle stuckness without collapsing. Knowing that confusion doesn't mean incompetence. Knowing that movement can always be restored. This kind of confidence doesn't depend on results, it depends on process mastery. And once you have that, creativity stops feeling fragile. Thinking stops feeling exhausting. Progress stops feeling random. You don't rely on mood. You rely on conditions. That's what most people miss. They wait for the right feeling. But the right feeling often comes after the right action, taken under the right conditions. When you internalize this, nothing flows, stops being a dead end. It becomes a checkpoint, a moment where you pause, adjust, and continue, without self-attack, without drama. You don't need to become someone else to think clearly. You need to stop violating how clarity actually works. If you want to anchor this insight, take a second and reflect on which condition you violate most often when you feel stuck. Naming it makes it visible. Visibility creates choice. Choice restores movement. And if this way of thinking is helping you see your own mind with more precision, stay connected. Not for motivation, but for understanding. Because once you understand how the system works, you stop being at its mercy. You don't unlock the mind by forcing it open. You unlock it by learning how not to lock it in the first place.